The Journey of Abraham, a sleep story. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world holds its breath between yesterday's sorrows and tomorrow's possibilities, there exists a space where ancient stories breathe with new meaning. Tonight, as you settle into the gentle embrace of approaching sleep, let your mind wander back through millennia to a time when the desert wind carried whispers of the divine, and ordinary men were called to extraordinary purposes. The stars that shine above you now are the same stars that guided a man named Abraham through the wilderness of faith. Close your eyes and feel the desert wind across your face. Tonight we walk with Abraham. Abraham, then called Abram, lived in the great city of Ur, where ziggurat towers pierced the sky like stone prayers and merchants haggled in a dozen tongues beneath colorful awnings. The streets buzzed with the energy of civilization. Potters at their wheels, weavers at their looms, scribes recording the transactions that bound their world together. It was a place of comfort, of certainty, of known quantities and predictable tomorrows. Yet in the depths of his soul, Abram felt a restlessness that prosperity could not quiet. He was 75 years old, his beard silver as moonlight, his eyes holding the accumulated wisdom of decades spent navigating the complexities of trade and family. He had wealth, respect, a position of honor among his people. He had everything a man of his age might hope for, except the one thing that might have given it all meaning. Sarai, his beloved wife, remained childless despite their years of hoping, praying, and consulting the wise women of the city. In a culture where children were legacy and lineage was everything, their childlessness cast a shadow over even their greatest achievements. Each sunset brought them closer to the edge of life, with no heir to carry their names into tomorrow. It was on one such evening, as Abram sat in the courtyard of his house watching the stars emerge like scattered diamonds across the darkening sky, that he heard it, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, from within his heart and beyond the furthest constellation. Abram. The voice was neither loud nor soft, neither commanding nor pleading. Abram felt his pulse quicken, though whether from fear or anticipation, he could not say. Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. The words settled over him like a blanket woven from moonbeams and possibility. They made no practical sense. How could a childless man become a great nation? How could someone his age begin again in an unknown land? Yet somewhere deeper than logic, deeper than fear, Abram felt the rightness of it, the way a river recognizes its course to the sea. He found Sarai inside, grinding grain by lamplight, her movements graceful despite her years. When he told her of the voice and its impossible promise, she looked at him with eyes that held depths of understanding accumulated through decades of shared dreams and disappointments. "You believe this voice?" she asked, with the careful attention of one who had learned to distinguish between wishful thinking and genuine revelation. "I do," Abram replied, surprised by the certainty in his own voice. "I cannot explain why, but I do." Sarai nodded slowly. "Then we go," she said simply. "We have waited so long for a child. Perhaps it is time to become children ourselves, to trust and follow where we cannot see." That night, they lay awake planning their departure. They would take Lot, Abram's nephew, whose own parents had died young. They would take their servants, their flocks, their accumulated treasures, but they would leave behind everything that had defined them: their extended family, their social position, their place in a community that understood them. They were choosing to become strangers in a strange land, guided only by a voice that promised impossible things. The morning of departure arrived clothed in golden sunlight and bittersweet farewells. Abram's father, Terah, stood in the doorway of the family home, his aged hands trembling slightly as he blessed his son for a journey he could not understand. "May the gods of our fathers watch over you," the old man whispered, pressing a small clay figurine into Abram's palm, a household deity worn smooth by generations of faithful handling. Gently, Abram pressed the figurine back into his father's hands. "I will carry your blessing, Father, but I go to meet a God who needs no image to contain him." The caravan that wound its way out of Ur that morning was a small city in motion. Camels laden with supplies, servants driving goats and sheep, wagons creaking under the weight of possessions that suddenly seemed both precious and insignificant. At the head of it all rode Abram and Sarai, their faces turned toward horizons they had never seen. The first weeks of travel were hardest. Each night, as they made camp in unfamiliar places, homesickness settled over them like fog. Lot, young and resilient, adapted quickly to life on the road, but Abram could see the strain in Sarai's careful smile. "Do you regret coming?" he asked her one night as they sat by their fire, watching sparks spiral up toward the indifferent stars. Sarai considered the question with the thoroughness that was her nature. "I regret the difficulty," she said finally. "I regret sleeping on the ground and drinking bitter water and not knowing what we will eat tomorrow. But I do not regret following you. I do not regret following the voice you heard." They traveled for months, following trade routes and shepherd paths, guided by Abram's growing sense of direction that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than knowledge. The land of Canaan, when they finally reached it, was not the paradise Abram might have imagined. It was beautiful in its way. Rolling hills clothed in olive trees, valleys where barley waved like green seas in the wind. But it was also occupied, controlled, by peoples who looked suspiciously at this small caravan of wealthy strangers. At Shechem, beneath the great oak tree that local inhabitants said was sacred to their gods, Abram heard the voice again, "To your offspring I will give this land." Looking around at the Canaanites going about their daily business, Abram felt the weight of the promise. This land belonged to others now. How could it ever belong to descendants he did not have? Yet he built an altar there, stacking stones with his own hands in a pattern that felt somehow ancient and eternal. When he finished, he stood before the simple structure and called upon the name of the Lord, not the familiar gods of his fathers, but the voice that had called him from comfort into mystery. The prayer that rose from his heart surprised him with its simplicity. "I do not understand your ways, but I trust your promises. I do not know how you will fulfill your words, but I believe you will. I am here as you asked me to be. I am listening." The first great test came not as a dramatic trial, but as the slow erosion of everyday difficulty. A famine settled over Canaan like a curse, withering crops and driving wild animals deeper into the wilderness in search of water. The local peoples, struggling to feed their own families, grew less welcoming to strangers. Abram's flocks grew thin, their ribs showing beneath coats that had lost their luster. His servants looked to him with increasing worry, their unspoken question clear in their eyes. What kind of God leads his followers into starvation? The practical solution was obvious. Egypt, fed by the reliable flooding of the Nile, remained prosperous even when other lands suffered. It was the reasonable thing to do, the responsible choice for a man with people depending on him. So they went to Egypt. Sarai, despite her years, remained a woman of remarkable beauty, her grace and intelligence making her attractive in ways that transcended mere physical appearance. As they approached the Egyptian border, Abram realized that her beauty might put them both in danger. "Say you are my sister," he asked her, the words feeling like betrayal even as he spoke them. It was not entirely a lie. They were half-siblings as well as husband and wife, but it was not entirely the truth either. Sarai looked at him with an expression he could not read. "You would rather preserve your life than claim me as your wife?" "I would rather we both live than we both die," Abram replied, though he felt the cowardice in his words. In Egypt, as Abram had feared, Sarai's beauty caught the attention of Pharaoh's officials, who brought her into the royal household. Abram, introduced as her brother, was showered with gifts: sheep and cattle, donkeys, servants, even camels. But wealth gained through deception brought no joy. Each night, Abram lay awake wondering what was happening to Sarai in the palace, hating himself for his cowardice, wondering if this was how the great journey would end. The resolution came suddenly. Plague struck Pharaoh's household, not dramatic afflictions, but troubles that made it clear to the Egyptian wise men that the gods were displeased. When the truth about Sarai's identity was revealed, Pharaoh summoned Abram with anger tempered by respectful fear. "What have you done to me?" the king demanded. "Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Here is your wife, take her and go." They left Egypt richer in material goods, but poorer in confidence. The journey north was quiet. Both Abram and Sarai lost in thoughts about the cost of their choices. It was Sarai who finally broke the silence as they camped near Bethel. "We survived," she said simply. "We made mistakes, and we survived. Perhaps that is also part of what it means to be chosen, not to be perfect, but to be forgiven, not to avoid all errors, but to learn from them." Abram looked at the altar he had built so long ago, its stones now weathered but still standing. He had returned to the place of his first prayer, but he was not the same man who had built it. He was more aware of his weaknesses now, more humble about his capacity for failure, but also more amazed by the persistence of divine grace. The return to Canaan brought unexpected prosperity, but prosperity brought its own problems. The land around Bethel could not support the combined herds of both Abram and Lot. Grass became scarce, water sources were strained, and tensions began to rise between their herdsmen. The crisis came to a head when violence erupted over access to a well. That evening, as Abram tended to his injured servant's wounds, he realized that the situation had moved beyond easy solutions. He found Lot sitting alone on a hill overlooking their camps, his young face troubled as he watched the cook fires dotting the landscape like fallen stars. "We cannot go on like this," Abram said, settling beside his nephew. "I know," Lot replied, "but I don't know how to fix it." "Then we must separate," Abram said quietly. "Is not the whole land before us? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left." The next morning they stood together on the height overlooking the Jordan Valley, the lush plain spreading before them like a green promise, well-watered and fertile, with the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah gleaming in the distance. "Choose," Abram said, though his heart ached at the word. Lot looked out over the Jordan Valley, then back at the hill country where Abram would remain. "Are you certain about this?" Lot asked. "You're giving me first choice of the best land." Abram smiled, and for a moment the weariness fell away from his features. "I'm giving you the choice that seems best to human eyes," he said. "But I have learned that the God who called me from Ur sees with different eyes than ours. I trust his promises more than I trust appearances." So Lot chose the Jordan Valley and moved toward Sodom, while Abram remained in the hill country, dwelling near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron. As their caravan separated, both men felt the weight of the moment. Not just a practical division of territory, but a parting of destinies. That evening, as Abram watched Lot's fires disappear into the distance, he heard the voice again, clearer than it had been in months. "Look around from where you are, to the north and south, to the east and west. All the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted." The promise seemed more impossible than ever. Abram was now 85 years old, Sarai nearly as old, and still they had no child. How could his offspring be like the dust of the earth when he had no offspring at all? Yet as he looked out over the land that stretched to every horizon, he felt a deep peace settle over him. He had given away what seemed like the better portion to preserve relationships and maintain peace. In human terms, it might have been foolish, but he was learning to see with different eyes, to trust in promises that transcended immediate circumstances. Years passed in a rhythm of seasons and small victories. Abram's flocks multiplied, his household grew, and his reputation as a man of justice spread throughout the region. But the central promise remained unfulfilled. Each year made it seem more unlikely that he and Sarai would ever have the child that would begin the great nation God had promised. It was during this time of growing doubt that Abram experienced his most profound encounter with the divine. He had been praying, as was his custom in the evening, when suddenly he felt himself caught up in a vision more real than the material world around him. He found himself in a place that was both familiar and utterly strange. A vast plain under a sky so thick with stars that they seemed close enough to touch. Before him stood a figure whose face he could not quite see, whose presence filled him with awe that was equally mixed with comfort and terror. "Do not be afraid, Abram," the figure said, and the voice was the same that had first called him from Ur, now speaking with a richness and depth that seemed to contain all the music of creation. "I am your shield, your very great reward." But years of disappointment had taught Abram a different kind of boldness, the courage to speak honestly even to the divine. "Sovereign Lord," he replied, "what can you give me since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus? You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir." The response came not in words, but in action. Suddenly, Abram found himself lifted, transported to a vantage point high above the earth, where the stars spread before him in numbers beyond counting. "Look up at the sky and count the stars. If indeed you can count them," the voice said, "so shall your offspring be." Standing there in the vastness of that celestial vision, surrounded by the infinite depths of space and the countless points of light that spoke of worlds beyond imagining, Abram felt something fundamental shift within him. The promise was not about his ability to father children at his advanced age, or Sarai's capacity to conceive despite her years. It was about the power of the one who had made the stars themselves, who commanded forces beyond human comprehension. In that moment, Abram believed, not with the tentative hope he had carried for years, but with a deep, unshakable conviction that transcended logic and circumstance. The God who had scattered stars across the universe like grains of sand was surely capable of giving children to those who were past the age of childbearing. When the vision faded and he found himself back in his tent, Sarai asleep beside him, the experience remained vivid in his memory. But more than the memory, something else remained. A certainty that felt like a physical presence in his chest. A quiet confidence that the promise would be fulfilled regardless of how impossible it seemed. The next morning, he told Sarai about the vision, watching her face carefully as he described the stars and the voice and the overwhelming sense of divine presence. "I wish I could have such certainty," she said finally. "I wish I could feel what you felt." "Perhaps faith is not the same for everyone," Abram replied. "Perhaps yours is to trust not in visions you receive, but in the character of the one who called us both. Your faith has been in following me as I follow the voice I heard. That may be a more difficult faith than mine." Time moved differently in the desert, measured not in days or months, but in the subtle changes of seasons. Abram was now 99 years old, his body bearing the weight of decades, but his spirit somehow more youthful than it had been in Ur. It was then that the voice came to him again, but this time with changes that would mark a new chapter in the ancient story. "Your name will no longer be Abram," the voice said as he sat in the shade of the great oak at Mamre. "Your name will be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations. As for Sarai, your wife, you are no longer to call her Sarai. Her name will be Sarah, for she will be the mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her." Abraham. The name felt strange on his tongue at first, but also somehow more true than the name he had carried for nearly a century. And Sarah, his beloved Sarah, would indeed be the mother of the promised child. The most remarkable confirmation came a few months later, on a day so hot that even the lizards sought shade and the air shimmered with heat waves. Abraham was sitting at the entrance to his tent when he looked up and saw 3 men standing nearby. Something about them caught his attention immediately. Not their appearance, which was ordinary enough, but a quality of presence that made the air around them seem charged with significance. Abraham felt compelled to offer them hospitality, running to meet them despite his age and bowing low in greeting. "If I have found favor in your eyes, my lord," he said, "do not pass your servant by. Let me get you something to eat so you can be refreshed." The meal he prepared was fit for kings: tender calf, fresh bread that Sarah baked quickly from their finest flour, curds and milk served in their best vessels. As they ate, Abraham stood nearby, ready to serve their needs, but also listening carefully to their conversation. "Where is your wife Sarah?" one of them asked, and Abraham felt his pulse quicken at the casual use of her new name, which he had not mentioned to them. "There in the tent," he replied. "I will surely return to you about this time next year," the visitor said, his voice carrying an authority that made the words feel like a decree from heaven itself. "And Sarah, your wife, will have a son." From inside the tent came a sound that might have been a cough or a quickly stifled laugh. Sarah, now 90 years old, her body long past any possibility of childbearing, found the prediction both wonderful and absurd. Why did Sarah laugh and say, "Will I really have a child now that I am old?" The visitor asked. "Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son." Sarah, embarrassed at being overheard, called out, "I did not laugh." But the visitor's response was gentle rather than reproving. "Yes, you did laugh." After the visitors departed, Abraham and Sarah sat together in the cooling air of evening, both stunned by what they had experienced. The promise had been made specific, not someday, not eventually, but within a year. "I did laugh," Sarah admitted, taking Abraham's hand in hers. "Not from disbelief, but from joy mixed with amazement. The idea of becoming a mother at my age, it seems like the kind of joke God might enjoy playing on the world." "Then perhaps," Abraham replied, "laughter will be the child's gift to us. Perhaps joy is what was missing from our earlier understanding of the promise." True to the visitor's word, Sarah conceived and bore a son the following year. When the child was born, healthy and strong despite his parents' advanced age, they named him Isaac, which means laughter. For Sarah said, "God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me." The birth of Isaac transformed everything. The promise that had seemed impossible for decades was suddenly, tangibly real. Abraham held his son and marveled not only at the miracle of the child himself, but at the way God had chosen to fulfill the ancient covenant through the natural process of conception and birth, made possible at an impossible time by divine grace. Isaac grew into a boy of remarkable intelligence and spiritual sensitivity, the joy of his parents, old age, and the obvious heir to all the promises God had made to Abraham. He was quick to learn, eager to help with the flocks, and possessed of a mature faith that sometimes surprised even his parents. It was precisely because Isaac meant so much, not just as a beloved son, but as the fulfillment of decades of promises, that the command came with such devastating force. Abraham was alone on a hilltop when he heard the voice, as clear and undeniable as it had been on that first night in Ur. "Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." The words hit Abraham like physical blows. He staggered backward, his mind reeling as he tried to process what he had just heard. Sacrifice Isaac? The child of promise, the son through whom all the covenant promises were to be fulfilled. It made no sense, not practically, not theologically, not emotionally. Abraham spent that night in prayer, wrestling with the command like Jacob would later wrestle with the angel. He considered every possible interpretation. Perhaps he had misheard. Perhaps this was a test of willingness rather than a literal command. Perhaps God would provide some alternative at the last moment. But beneath all his questioning, he felt the same unmistakable certainty that had called him from Ur and sustained him through decades of waiting. This was indeed the voice of the Lord, and the command was real. The next morning, he prepared for the journey with meticulous care. He cut wood for the offering, saddled his donkey, and chose 2 young servants to accompany them. When Isaac joined them, eager for an adventure with his father, Abraham could barely meet the boy's trusting eyes. The journey to Moriah took 3 days. 3 days during which Abraham wrestled with despair, faith, doubt, and a love so deep it threatened to tear him apart. Each night, As Isaac slept trustingly beside him, Abraham stared at the stars that had once filled him with such hope. On the third day, Abraham saw the mountain in the distance, its peak standing stark against the morning sky. He left the servants at the base with the donkey, loaded the wood onto Isaac's shoulders, and took the fire and knife in his own hands. As they climbed together, Isaac's question came with innocence that made it even more painful. "Father, the fire and wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham's answer came from a depth of faith he had not known he possessed. "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." At the top of the mountain, Abraham built an altar with shaking hands, arranging the wood with desperate precision. When he turned to Isaac, the boy saw something in his father's face that made him go very still. "Father?" Isaac said quietly. "My son," Abraham replied, his voice breaking, "God has asked me to offer you as a sacrifice. I do not understand it. I do not want to do it, but I trust that the God who gave you to us will find a way to keep his promises, even beyond death." Isaac, wise beyond his years and formed by a lifetime of watching his parents trust in divine promises, nodded slowly. "Then I will trust with you, Father." Abraham bound Isaac gently, lifted him onto the altar, and raised the knife with a hand that trembled with grief and faith in equal measure. In that moment, suspended between obedience and agony, he embodied the ultimate test of faith, the willingness to sacrifice even the most precious gift for the sake of trust in divine goodness. "Abraham, Abraham!" The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, stopping his hand at the very moment when the knife would have fallen. "Here I am," he gasped. "Do not lay a hand on the boy. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Looking up, Abraham saw a ram caught by its horns in a thicket nearby. With hands that shook with relief and wonder, he untied Isaac, helped him down from the altar, and offered the ram in his place. On the way down the mountain, Isaac walked close to his father, their relationship deepened by the trial they had shared. "Father," he said quietly, "I understand now why you were willing to trust God with my life. You had already learned to trust him with your own." Abraham nodded, his arm around his son's shoulders. "And I understand now that faith is not about getting what we want from God, but about trusting his character, even when we cannot understand his methods." Years flowed like water in the desert, precious and measured. Abraham lived to see Isaac grow into manhood, marry Rebekah, and begin a family of his own. He witnessed the birth of grandsons, Jacob and Esau, and held them in arms that had once trembled with the knife above Isaac's bound form. Sarah died at 127, her passing marking the end of an era. Abraham purchased a cave at Machpelah to serve as her burial place. The first piece of the promised land that he actually owned, bought not with conquest, but with silver. Standing beside Sarah's tomb, Abraham reflected on the strange mathematics of divine promises. God had pledged him all the land as far as the eye could see, yet the only portion he possessed was a burial cave. The nations that would come from his descendants existed only in potential. The blessings that would flow to all peoples through his lineage were still waiting to unfold across centuries yet to come. Yet Abraham felt no sense of incompleteness. The promises had been kept in the only way that mattered, not in their immediate, visible manifestation, but in the unshakable certainty that they would be fulfilled in God's perfect timing. Faith was not about seeing the destination, but about trusting the guide. Abraham himself died at 175, gathered to his people in peaceful manner. Isaac and Ishmael came together to bury him beside Sarah in the cave at Machpelah. Even in death, he was bringing reconciliation. But the true epilogue to Abraham's story was not written in his lifetime. It was inscribed in the lives of countless others who would follow in his footsteps. Not the geographical journey from Ur to Canaan, but the spiritual journey from comfort to trust, from the familiar to the faithful unknown. His story suggests that the greatest adventures begin not when we have all the answers, but when we are willing to follow the questions that disturb our peace. It reminds us that faith is not the absence of doubt, but the decision to move forward despite uncertainty. In our modern world of instant communication and immediate results, Abraham's patient faith feels almost revolutionary. He waited 25 years for the child of promise, lived in tents while being promised a land, and died without seeing the full manifestation of what he had been called to begin. Yet his life was not one of disappointment, but of deep satisfaction. As you drift toward sleep tonight, consider the voice that called Abraham from his comfortable life to an uncertain journey. Perhaps it speaks to you as well, not necessarily calling you to leave your geographical home, but inviting you to leave the safety of your assumptions, the comfort of your certainties. The stars that shine above you tonight are the same stars Abraham saw when God promised him descendants beyond counting. They have witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the birth and death of countless generations, the unfolding of promises that seemed impossible when they were first made. They shine with the light of possibilities not yet realized, of stories not yet told, of journeys not yet begun. Abraham's story continues, not in the ancient past, but in every heart that chooses trust over fear, faith over certainty, the unknown path over the familiar road. Sleep well, knowing that the God who called Abraham is the same God who watches over your own journey. Rest in the assurance that promises made in love are always kept, even when their fulfillment comes in ways we never expected. And wake tomorrow, ready to hear your own voice calling you from whatever you may inhabit, toward whatever promised land awaits your faithful steps. The journey continues. The stars are still shining, and somewhere in the space between sleeping and waking, the voice that called Abraham continues to whisper to all who have ears to hear. Trust me. Follow me. I will make your life a blessing.